Have you ever felt invisible? Have you ever been judged by what people think you are instead of who you really are? My name is Maya Johnson. I'm 12 years old, and this is the story of how my teacher tried to break me, without knowing she was messing with the youngest person in history to graduate from Harvard. When I walked into Westfield Middle School in Atlanta, Georgia, at the beginning of the 2023 school year, I knew it would be different. My parents, Dr. Marcus and Dr. Angela Johnson, both professors at Emory University, had enrolled me there after years of homeschooling and college courses. Maya, my mother said, holding my small hands, you need to have a normal school experience. Make friends your age. Be a kid. But being a kid wasn't something that came naturally to me. At 8 years old, I was already taking advanced calculus. At 9, I published my first paper on number theory. At 11, I became the youngest person in history to graduate from Harvard with a double major in mathematics and physics. Now at 12, I was sitting in a plastic desk, pretending not to know that the equation Mrs. Henderson had written on the board was completely wrong. As you can see, she said with that condescending voice teachers use when they think they're talking to dumb children. This is the formula for calculating velocity. Distance divided by time squared. My hand shot up instinctively. It was a reflex. During 4 years at university, I always participated in academic discussions. Yes, Maya? Mrs. Henderson couldn't hide her irritation. Sorry, but the formula is incorrect. Velocity is distance divided by time, not time squared. That would be acceleration, but even then, the silence that followed was deafening. 30 pairs of eyes turned to me. Some laughed quietly. Others just stared at me like I was some weird creature. Mrs. Henderson placed the marker on the desk with enough force to make noise. Maya Johnson. My name came out of her mouth like a curse. Children like you need to learn to be quiet and listen, not teach. I have 15 years of experience educating young people. You're 12 years old and come from, well, we all know where you come from. If you're watching this and have ever felt small, leave a like. Because at that moment, I felt smaller than a grain of sand. The insinuation was clear. She had looked at my address, seen that I lived on the south side of Atlanta, and drawn her conclusions. To her, I was just another problematic black child who needed to be put in her place. What she didn't know was that my parents had chosen our modest house on purpose, even though they could afford much more. Humility and community connection, my father always said. During recess, while other kids played, I sat under a tree and opened my notebook. I couldn't help it. I started solving differential calculus problems, equations that calmed me like classical music calms other people. It was my defense mechanism against humiliation. What is that? Jasmine, a girl from my class, approached curiously. Just, math, I mumbled, quickly closing the notebook. That doesn't look like 7th grade math, she said, frowning. It looks collegiate. Before I could answer, Mrs. Henderson appeared. Maya, what are you doing there alone? The other students are playing. You need to socialize properly. She was doing some really weird math, Jasmine commented innocently. Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed. Let me see that notebook. My heart raced. It's just drafts. I said, give me the notebook. Now. With trembling hands, I handed over my notebook. She flipped through the pages, seeing differential equations, theorem proofs, notations I had copied from scientific papers I read for pleasure. Her face went through a sequence of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally anger. Where did you get this? Did you copy it from the internet? From your parents' books? I solved it myself. Don't lie to me, young lady. 12-year-old children don't solve university calculus. Especially children with your background. Again, the racial insinuation hung in the air like toxic smoke. Tears formed in my eyes, but I held them back. I had learned at university that crying during academic debates was seen as weakness. The situation got drastically worse the following week. Our class had received an assignment. Write a 2-page essay on how science impacts our daily lives. For most students, this would mean talking about cell phones or video games. For me, it was an opportunity to explore something that truly fascinated me. I spent the weekend writing about quantum physics and its practical applications. I explained how quantum computers work, how quantum entanglement is revolutionizing telecommunications, and how quantum mechanics explains why the sun shines. These were concepts I had studied in depth during my final year at Harvard. When I turned in the essay on Monday, I noticed Mrs. Henderson's sarcastic smile. 14 pages? The assignment was 2, Maya. Sorry, I got carried away. I thought demonstrating extra knowledge would be positive. Extra knowledge, she repeated, shaking her head. We'll see what kind of knowledge you really have. On Wednesday, she called me to her desk after class. The principal, Mrs. Patricia Williams, was there too, with a serious expression that made me swallow hard. Maya, Mrs. Henderson began, holding my essay like it was criminal evidence, we need to have a serious conversation about academic honesty. I don't understand. This essay, she said, waving the paper in the air, is clearly plagiarized. You copied from university sources and tried to pass it off as your own work. My world collapsed. I didn't plagiarize anything. I wrote it all myself. The principal leaned forward. Maya, honey, this essay mentions concepts that not even our high school physics teachers fully master. There's no problem with admiring others' work, but presenting it as yours is unacceptable. But I really wrote it. I can explain every concept, every equation. Mrs. Henderson laughed. A cold, cruel sound. A 12-year-old black child who lives on the south side of Atlanta doesn't understand quantum physics. Maya, stop lying and accept the consequences of your actions. The tears I had held back for weeks finally fell. They weren't tears of sadness, but of absolute frustration. How do you prove you are who you are when nobody believes? We're going to call your parents, the principal said softly. And I think it would be good for you to talk to our school psychologist. Sometimes when children feel pressured at home to perform beyond their capabilities, the insinuation hit me like a punch to the stomach. They thought my parents were academically abusing me, forcing me to study beyond what was appropriate for my age and race. That afternoon, I was sent to Mrs. Rodriguez's office, the school psychologist. Her room smelled like lavender and had motivational posters on the walls. Believe in yourself, nothing can stop you, said one of them, which seemed cruelly ironic given the circumstances. Maya, I want you to feel comfortable talking to me, she said with a sweet voice that probably worked with truly traumatized children. Do your parents pressure you to study difficult things at home? No, ma'am. They actually try to make me relax more. Do you have unsupervised internet access? Do you spend a lot of time copying things from academic websites? Each question was a new stab. She was building a case against my family, preparing a report that could result in a visit from social services. Mrs. Rodriguez, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, what if I really understood these concepts? What if I really was different? She smiled with that condescension adults use with children living in fantasies. Maya, it's normal to have an active imagination at your age, but it's important to distinguish between fantasy and reality. You're an intelligent girl, but quantum physics is years beyond what any child can comprehend. When I got home that night, my parents were waiting. The school had called as promised. My mother, Dr. Angela Johnson, professor of cognitive neuroscience at Emory, was sitting at the kitchen table with an expression I recognized. It was the same one she made when reviewing poorly founded scientific papers. Maya, my father said softly. The school called today, I know. They think you're academically abusing me. My parents exchanged looks. 23 years of marriage had taught them to communicate without words. Princess, my mother said, maybe we made a mistake enrolling you in a regular school. You're suffering unnecessarily. No! The intensity of my response surprised me. I don't want to run away. I want them to see who I really am. My father sighed deeply. Maya, sometimes the world isn't ready to accept who we are, especially when we're different from what they expect. But I had made a decision. That night, lying in my bed surrounded by framed diplomas and congratulatory letters from Harvard, I began to plan. If Mrs. Henderson wanted evidence of who I was, I would give her evidence she would never forget. The next day, she announced that due to the academic dishonesty situation, I would be removed from the advanced math class and placed in remedial courses. For your own good, she said, unable to hide the satisfaction in her voice. As I packed my belongings, I heard Jasmine whisper to a friend. I knew she was weird. Who solves math during recess? 3 weeks passed in which I became a ghost at school. I sat in the back of the remedial classroom, pretending to struggle with basic arithmetic problems I could have solved at 6 years old. Mrs. Henderson made sure to pass by frequently, always with a sarcastic comment about how I was at my appropriate level now. It was during this period that I found an unexpected ally. Mr. David Chen, The computer science teacher saw me one day during lunch programming on my personal laptop. Is that Python? He asked, looking over my shoulder. Yes, I'm working on an algorithm for neural network optimization. He blinked several times, as if processing what he had heard. Maya, where did you learn advanced programming? I took some online courses, I replied vaguely. It was technically true, although the online courses were computer science graduate classes at MIT that I had audited during my final year at Harvard. Mr. Chen sat beside me. Can I see the code? I showed him the program I was developing. It was an application of machine learning theories I had studied, implemented in elegant and efficient code. Maya, he said after a few minutes, his voice filled with admiration. This code is graduate level. How could a 7th grade student— Mr. Chen, I interrupted him, do you believe people can be different from what they appear? He looked into my eyes for a long moment. I believe human potential is much vaster than most people imagine. Why do you ask? At that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. Because I have something to show you. But you have to promise you'll keep an open mind. He nodded slowly. I pulled out my phone and showed him photos. First, my graduation photo from Harvard, wearing the traditional cap and gown, surrounded by graduates who were 15 years older than me. Then, recommendation letters from Harvard professors. Scientific papers with my name as principal author. Certificates from advanced courses. Official university documentation confirming that Maya Elizabeth Johnson had graduated magna cum laude in mathematics and physics at 11 years old. Mr. Chen looked at the photos, then at me, then at the photos again. His expression went through shock, disbelief, and finally, growing anger. Maya, he whispered, what are you doing here? Why did your parents enroll you in a public middle school when you're already a Harvard graduate? They wanted me to have a normal childhood experience. To make friends my age. To learn to be just a kid. And Mrs. Henderson? She doesn't know. Nobody knows, except you now. Mr. Chen closed the laptop and looked at me with an intensity that made me realize he was fully understanding the gravity of the situation. Maya, you're being systematically humiliated and diminished by a teacher who has less formal education than you. This is more than unfair. It's abusive. I know. But I want her to find out in the worst possible way. A smile slowly appeared on Mr. Chen's face. Do you have something in mind? Actually, I do. But I'm going to need your help. The plan we devised was simple but devastating. The school had an annual tradition, the district science fair, where students from all over Atlanta presented projects to judges from the local academic community. It was a prestigious event with substantial prizes and recognition for winners. Mrs. Henderson always bragged about her students participating, although they had never won anything significant. This year, she had chosen her favorites to represent the school. 3 white students from wealthy families who made projects about baking soda volcanoes and bean germination. Mr. Chen, I said during our secret meeting in the computer lab, how many students can each school register? Officially 5, but Mrs. Henderson only registered 3 because she said, quality is better than quantity. So there are still 2 spots? Technically, yes. But registration closes tomorrow, I smiled. It was the same expression I made when solving a particularly challenging theorem. Perfect. That night, I worked until 3 a.m. preparing my presentation. It wouldn't be a typical science fair project. It would be an original research presentation on artificial intelligence applications in medical diagnostics, based on work I had begun during a summer internship at my mother's neuroscience lab. Mr. Chen helped me with the registration, submitting it directly to the district coordinator. Maya Johnson, Westfield Middle School, application of convolutional neural networks for early Alzheimer's detection through speech pattern analysis. When Mrs. Henderson found out the following Friday, her reaction was epic. What? She screamed in the hallway, holding the registration paper like it was radioactive. Who authorized this? Mr. Chen, with a calm I deeply admired, replied, registration was open to all students. Maya wanted to participate. Maya is in remedial classes. She plagiarized an essay. She can't represent our school. Actually, Mr. Chen said, consulting his notes, the fair regulations don't allow discrimination based on internal academic performance. If a student is enrolled, she can participate. The vein in Mrs. Henderson's forehead was visibly pulsing. She's going to embarrass us. Imagine what they'll think when they see a child like her trying to talk about subjects she doesn't understand. Again, the racial implication was there, Clear as crystal. Well, Mr. Chen said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, I guess we'll find out on Saturday. That Friday night, my parents helped me prepare. They knew about the plan, of course, and although they were worried about the emotional consequences for me, they understood why I needed to do this. Princess, my mother said, adjusting my navy blue blazer, are you sure you want to do this? Once the truth comes out, there's no going back. Mom, I've spent 3 months being treated like I'm stupid, dishonest, and problematic. It's time for people to see who I really am. My father, who had been quiet during our preparation, finally spoke. Maya, do you understand that after this your life will change? You won't be able to have a normal school experience anymore. I looked at him, this gentle man who had taught me that knowledge was power, but wisdom was knowing when to use that power. Dad, normal was never an option for me. I was born different. It's time to stop pretending I'm not. On Saturday morning, we arrived at the Atlanta Convention Center 2 hours before the event. I wanted time to set up my presentation without rushing. When we entered the large hall, I was impressed by the scale of the event. Hundreds of booths, thousands of people, distinguished judges with badges from Emory, Georgia Tech, and the CDC. My booth was strategically positioned right in the middle of the main pavilion. Mr. Chen had made sure of that. I began setting up my equipment: laptop, projector, displays with neural network graphics, interactive demonstrations of the algorithm working. At 9:30, Mrs. Henderson arrived with her 3 chosen students. When she saw me, her face went through a variety of expressions: surprise, anger, and finally a kind of anticipatory malice. Well, she said, approaching my booth. Let's see what kind of show Maya has put together for us today. Her favorite students, Tyler, Madison, and Brittany, were behind her, looking at my setup with curiosity. My presentation looked like it belonged at a medical conference, not a middle school science fair. That thing, Tyler said, pointing to one of my graphs, looks pretty fake. Like, who's going to believe a kid made that? Mrs. Henderson smiled. Exactly my thought. Tyler, let's see how long it takes the judges to figure out all this is copied from the internet. But then something happened that she didn't expect. Dr. Patricia Johnson approached our group. Not my mother, a different Dr. Patricia Johnson, chief neurologist at Emory University Hospital and one of the main judges of the fair. Excuse the interruption, she said, looking at the name on my booth, but is it possible you're Maya Johnson? The Maya Johnson who published the paper on neural connectivity patterns in children with ADHD? The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Henderson went pale. Her students looked confused between me and the doctor. Yes, ma'am, I replied calmly. That work was based on my undergraduate research in my mother's lab. Extraordinary. I cited your work in my presentation at the International Congress of Neurology last month. I'm looking forward to seeing your presentation today. The science fair officially began at 10 a.m. During the first hour, I presented my project to small groups of visitors and preliminary judges. Each presentation was fluid, professional, and demonstrated not only theoretical knowledge, but practical understanding of the medical implications of my research. Mrs. Henderson passed by several times, clearly trying to hear something she could use against me. But every time she listened to my explanation about how convolutional neural networks can identify subtle patterns in speech that precede clinical symptoms of Alzheimer's by years, her discomfort increased visibly. At 11:30, the moment I had been waiting for arrived. The main judges would make their final evaluations. Dr. Patricia Johnson returned to my booth, accompanied by Dr. Michael Stevens from the CDC and Dr. Sarah Kim from Georgia Tech. Maya, Dr. Johnson said, I'd like you to present your work to our main judging panel. We have 15 minutes for a complete presentation. Mrs. Henderson, who was evaluating Tyler's volcano project, stopped mid-sentence and came running. Doctors, I apologize, but there's been a misunderstanding. This student shouldn't be participating in the advanced category. She's in academic remediation and... Actually, Dr. Stevens interrupted gently, we reviewed her submission carefully. The work she submitted is absolutely in the appropriate category. Some of the concepts she's exploring are at the forefront of current medical research. Mrs. Henderson looked like she had been slapped. But she's only 12 years old. Age is irrelevant when it comes to scientific merit, Dr. Kim said firmly. We're here to evaluate the quality of research, not make assumptions based on demographics. I took a deep breath and began my presentation. For the next 15 minutes, I explained how I had developed an algorithm that could analyze speech patterns and identify linguistic markers indicating early cognitive decline. I demonstrated the software working in real time, showed validation data, and discussed clinical implications for early diagnosis. The judges asked complex technical questions about backpropagation in neural networks, about statistical bias in medical datasets, about ethical considerations in diagnostic AI. I answered each question with precision and confidence, citing relevant literature and admitting limitations of my work where appropriate. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. Then Dr. Johnson began to applaud, followed by the other judges. "Maya," she said, "in my 20 years evaluating scientific projects, I've rarely seen such a sophisticated presentation. This work could be presented at any international medical conference." Mrs. Henderson stood behind the judges, her mouth open in absolute shock. It was no longer possible to deny. She had just watched a 12-year-old child demonstrate expertise that rivals graduate researchers. "There's one thing that makes me curious," Dr. Stevens said. "Where did you develop this level of knowledge? What academic programs have you attended?" I looked directly at Mrs. Henderson when I answered. I completed my undergraduate degree at Harvard at age 11, with a double major in mathematics and physics. During my final year, I interned at Dr. Rachel Cohen's computational neuroscience lab, where I began this research. The effect was like a bomb exploding in slow motion. Dr. Johnson took a step back, her eyes wide. Dr. Stevens said "holy shit" quietly, then apologized for the profanity. Dr. Kim simply gaped, but Mrs. Henderson's reaction was the most dramatic. She went completely pale, then red, then pale again. Her hands began to tremble. That's impossible," she whispered. "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone, "I can show my official documentation if you'd like to verify." Dr. Johnson was the first to recover from the shock. "Maya, are you telling me you're a Harvard graduate and you're attending 7th grade? My parents wanted me to have a normal school experience. They thought it would be good for my social development." "And how has that experience been?" Dr. Stevens asked, but his eyes were already moving toward Mrs. Henderson, who seemed to be having an existential crisis. "Well," I said, choosing my words carefully, "it's been educational. I've learned a lot about how prejudices can blind people to others' potential." Mrs. Henderson finally found her voice. I didn't know. If you had told me from the beginning." "Mrs. Henderson," I interrupted gently, "you accused me of plagiarism when I wrote about quantum physics. You put me in remedial classes. You said children like me need to stay quiet. You called social services on my parents. At what point exactly should I have told you about my credentials?" The silence that followed was devastating. The three judges looked at Mrs. Henderson with expressions mixing disbelief and growing disapproval. "You put a Harvard graduate in remedial classes?" Dr. Kim asked, her voice loaded with incredulity. I didn't know that." "And accused her of plagiarism for writing about topics she clearly masters?" Mrs. Henderson couldn't answer. Her hands were visibly trembling now. Dr. Johnson turned to me. "Maya, do you have any interest in ongoing medical research? Because I'd very much like to discuss collaboration opportunities between you and our team." "I'd love that." "Dr. Johnson, thank you." At that moment, I realized a small crowd had formed around our booth. Other competitors, parents, teachers, all listening to this surreal conversation between renowned medical judges and a 12-year-old child who spoke like a colleague. Tyler, Madison, and Brittany were nearby, their childish science fair projects looking pathetic in comparison. They looked at me as if I were an alien who had disguised herself as a middle school student. "Mrs. Henderson," Dr. Stevens said, "I hope you've learned a valuable lesson here today about not underestimating your students." But I wasn't finished. I had saved the best part for last. "Actually," I said, capturing everyone's attention, "I'd like to take this moment to make an announcement." Everyone turned to me. Mrs. Henderson seemed to be waiting for the final blow, and she wasn't wrong. During the past 3 months at this school, I've experienced systematic discrimination and humiliation. I was judged not by my potential or knowledge, but by my age, my race, and my zip code. I was accused of academic dishonesty without any evidence. My parents were investigated for abuse based solely on the fact that a Black child couldn't naturally excel academically. The group around us had grown. People stopped their conversations to listen. But what hurt me most wasn't the treatment I received. It was realizing how many other brilliant children are being destroyed by educators who see limitations instead of possibilities. Dr. Johnson nodded vigorously. Maya, you're absolutely right. This is unacceptable in any educational environment. That's why, I continued, I'm announcing the creation of the Maya Johnson Foundation for Neglected Talents. Half of the prize money I win today will be used to identify and support children whose potential is being ignored or suppressed by educational prejudice. The applause started slowly, then grew until it became deafening. People I didn't even know were clapping, whistling, shouting, "Yes!" Mrs. Henderson was leaning against a table, looking like she was about to faint. And finally, I said, waiting for silence to return, I'd like to thank Mrs. Henderson for teaching me the most valuable lesson of my educational life. She looked at me with hope, as if maybe I was going to forgive her publicly. She taught me that knowledge without wisdom is dangerous, that positions of authority without humility can destroy lives, and that the greatest education anyone can receive is learning to recognize their own prejudices before they cause irreparable harm to others. The silence this time was absolute. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I hope, I concluded, that this experience inspires educators to look beyond their expectations and see the extraordinary potential that exists in every child, regardless of what that child looks like or where she comes from. The final ovation lasted 5 full minutes. Dr. Johnson had tears in her eyes. Dr. Stevens was shaking his head in admiration. Dr. Kim was already typing furiously on her phone, probably sharing what she had witnessed. When the results were announced 2 hours later, there was no surprise. First place in the advanced category, $25,000 prize, and a full research scholarship at Emory University. But the most satisfying moment wasn't winning. It was when Mrs. Henderson approached me during the award ceremony. Maya, she said, her voice broken, I need to apologize. Not just for how I treated you, but for everything this represents about me as an educator and as a person. I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had made my life miserable for 3 months, who had questioned my integrity, who had almost destroyed my faith in humanity. Mrs. Henderson, I said finally, I accept your apology. But more important than asking me for forgiveness is ensuring this never happens again to another child. She nodded vigorously. You're right. Completely right. I'm going to rethink everything about how I teach, how I evaluate, how I see my students. That's all I can ask for. 6 months later, my life had changed completely, but in ways I didn't expect. The story of the 12-year-old Harvard graduate who was placed in remedial classes went viral nationally. CNN, NBC, The New York Times. Everyone wanted to interview the child who had exposed educational prejudice so dramatically. But what makes me proudest isn't the media attention. It's what happened at Westfield Middle School. Mrs. Henderson underwent intensive training on implicit bias and cultural trauma. She became one of the most conscious educators at the school, constantly questioning her own assumptions about students. Mr. Chen was promoted to coordinator of programs for exceptional students. Now there's a formal protocol for identifying and nurturing unconventional talents, the accuses. School created a pilot program where students can demonstrate knowledge through independent projects instead of just standardized tests. Most importantly, 3 other children were identified as having exceptional abilities that were being neglected. Marcus, a 13-year-old black boy who was failing English, turned out to be a brilliant poet whose rhymes were being interpreted as disturbing by teachers. Aisha, a 14-year-old Somali girl considered slow, spoke 6 languages fluently, and was translating classic literature in her head during classes. The Maya Johnson Foundation grew beyond anything I imagined. We received donations from educators around the country who recognize their own stories in mine. So far, we've identified and supported 127 children whose potential was being ignored or suppressed. As for me, I returned to homeschooling part-time, but now I spend 2 days a week at Emory as a junior researcher. My work on diagnostic AI has been published in 3 major medical journals, and I'm collaborating with hospitals in 4 states. But the most important lesson I learned wasn't about neuroscience or algorithms. It was about the responsibility that comes with privilege. When you have exceptional abilities, whether intelligence, talent, or simply opportunities, you have an obligation to use those gifts to lift others up. If you're a parent, really look at your children. See beyond what you expect, beyond what seems normal. If you're an educator, question your assumptions. That quiet child in the back of the classroom might be solving equations in her head. That problematic student might be bored because the material is years behind what he already masters. And if you're a child watching this, especially if you're different, if you think differently, if you dream differently, know that your value isn't determined by what others believe you can do. You define your own limits. My name is Maya Johnson. At 13, I'm a Harvard graduate, medical researcher, and founder of a nonprofit organization. But more important than any title, I'm proof that extraordinary potential can exist in the most unexpected places. The only question is, are you willing to see?